At 24, Zara Williams thought working as a live-in maid for one of Seoul's most dangerous men would be the perfect place to disappear. She was wrong. When Korean crime boss Kang Mi-ho noticed the fresh bandage covering the bruise on her face, her carefully constructed invisibility shattered in an instant. 6 months earlier, Zara had been a nursing student at Seoul National University, focused and determined, working toward a degree that would give her independence and purpose. Her natural hair was styled in neat protective braids that framed her face beautifully, and her warm brown eyes held the kind of steady intelligence that made professors take notice. She was practical, hardworking, and knew the value of both education and perseverance. But Marcus Chun had other plans for her future. Marcus had seemed charming at first, the kind of older man who noticed her struggling with textbooks and offered to help with tuition. He was 32 to her 23, established in his import business, and persistent in his attention. What started as tutoring sessions became dates, dates became a relationship, and the relationship became a cage she hadn't recognized until the locks clicked shut. The first time he grabbed her wrist hard enough to bruise, she told herself it was stress. The second time he slapped her for questioning his business associates, she told herself it was temporary. By the time she realized Marcus's import business was a front for human trafficking, and he considered her part of his inventory, she had $50,000 in student loans and nowhere to run. The escape had been desperate and poorly planned. She liquidated her savings, abandoned her university program, and fled to Seoul's anonymity with nothing but determination and forged references. The position at the Kang estate had seemed like salvation, a live-in domestic role that offered housing, steady pay, and most importantly, the kind of invisibility that came with being household staff for a man who valued privacy above all else. Kang Mi-ho's penthouse occupied the top 3 floors of Seoul's most exclusive residential building, the kind of property that required security clearance just to enter the lobby. The space was a study in controlled luxury, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the city, custom Italian marble surfaces, and furniture that cost more than most people's annual salaries. Everything was pristine, ordered, and quietly expensive in the way that spoke of old money and older power. The air itself seemed to carry the weight of wealth and danger, a combination that made most visitors speak in hushed tones and avoid lingering in any room too long. Zara had been working there for 4 months, maintaining the impeccable standards Kang Mi-ho demanded while staying as invisible as possible. She arrived early, worked efficiently, and spoke only when spoken to. The other staff members, a rotating collection of security personnel and occasional service providers, treated her with professional distance. She preferred it that way. Invisibility meant safety, and safety meant Marcus couldn't find her. This particular morning started like any other. Zara arrived at 6 a.m. to begin her routine, moving quietly through the penthouse as she prepared Kang Mi-ho's breakfast and organized the day's necessities. She had learned his preferences over the months: black coffee served at exactly 7:30, morning briefings arranged by priority, and complete silence until he indicated otherwise. He was a man who valued precision, control, and the absence of surprises. At 28 minutes past 7, she heard his footsteps approaching the dining area. Kang Mi-ho moved with the kind of controlled grace that came from knowing exactly where he stood in the world's hierarchy. At 36, he commanded one of Seoul's most feared criminal organizations with an efficiency that bordered on artistry. He was Korean, with sharp features that looked carved rather than born, dark hair swept back with mathematical precision, and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. His morning suit was custom-tailored, dark charcoal wool that probably cost more than Zara's entire education fund, and he wore it with the casual confidence of a man who owned everything he surveyed. This morning, however, something was different. As Zara set his coffee cup down with practiced silence, Kang Mi-ho's dark eyes lifted from his tablet and focused on her face with laser intensity. She felt the shift in energy immediately, the way the air seemed to thicken when his attention became predatory rather than dismissive. "That's quite a bandage," he said quietly, his English perfect despite the slight accent that made every word sound like a considered decision. Zara's hand instinctively moved toward her left cheek, where the adhesive strip covered the worst of Marcus's latest reminder. She had hoped the concealer and strategic hair placement would be enough, but apparently nothing escaped Kong Miho's notice. I'm clumsy, she replied automatically, the lie practiced and smooth. Walked into a cabinet door yesterday evening. Kong Miho set down his coffee cup with deliberate precision, his movements controlled and somehow threatening despite their economy. He stood, his presence filling the space between them with an intensity that made Zara's pulse quicken. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of quiet authority that made arguing seem impossible. Show me, he said, moving closer until she could smell his expensive cologne, something woodsy and sharp that probably cost more than her monthly salary. Sir, I don't think that's necessary. I'm fine, really. His dark eyes held hers, and Zara realized with growing certainty that refusing wasn't actually an option. Kong Miho reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, but when she didn't move, he gently lifted the edge of the bandage with one finger. The bruise underneath was spectacular, purple and black with yellow edges that spoke of repeated impact. Kong Miho's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only sign of emotion crossing his otherwise controlled features. He lowered his hand, but didn't step back, studying her face with the kind of thoroughness that made Zara feel exposed despite her careful concealment. How long? He asked, and it wasn't really a question. How long what, sir? How long has someone been putting their hands on you? The words hit Zara like a physical blow. In 4 months of working for this dangerous, powerful man, she had never heard his voice carry quite that tone. There was something cold and final in it, something that made her think of headlines about rival organizations that simply disappeared overnight. Sir, I really don't know what you mean. I told you. I'm clumsy. I walked into a door. Accidents happen when you're tired. Kong Miho studied her for another long moment, his sharp features revealing nothing of his thoughts. Then he pulled his phone from his jacket pocket and pressed a single button. Dr. Kim, he said when someone answered, I need you at the penthouse immediately. Bring your medical bag and ask no questions. He ended the call and looked back at Zara, who was staring at him with undisguised alarm. Sit down, he said, gesturing toward one of the dining chairs. Dr. Kim will be here in 20 minutes. He's going to examine that injury properly and treat it correctly. Sir, that's really not necessary. I appreciate your concern, but I'm fine. It's just a small accident, nothing that requires medical attention. Kong Miho's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted slightly, and Zara realized she was arguing with a man who hadn't heard the word no in approximately a decade. Zara, he said, and hearing her name in his precise pronunciation made something flutter nervously in her chest. Someone has been hurting you. Someone thinks they have the right to put marks on your face and make you afraid. In my house, under my roof, that ends today. The certainty in his voice was absolute, the kind of statement that moved mountains and eliminated obstacles without hesitation. Zara found herself sitting in the chair before she consciously decided to comply, her mind spinning with the implications of this conversation. Why do you care? She asked quietly, the question escaping before she could stop it. I'm just your maid. You barely speak to me most days. Kong Miho was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her feel like he was cataloging every detail, every fear, every carefully hidden truth. Because I recognize the signs, he said finally. And because in my world, when someone damages what's under my protection, there are consequences. Permanent consequences. The words sent a chill down Zara's spine that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the sudden, terrifying realization that her carefully constructed invisibility had just crumbled entirely. Kong Miho had seen her, really seen her, and whatever happened next would change everything. Dr. Kim arrived exactly 20 minutes later, a distinguished man in his 50s who asked no questions and worked with the kind of professional discretion that came from treating injuries that couldn't be explained to authorities. He cleaned and properly bandaged Zara's face, prescribed antibiotics for the infection that was beginning to set in, and handed Kong Miho a detailed report before disappearing as quietly as he had arrived. Zara spent the rest of that day in a strange state of suspended reality, continuing her duties while acutely aware that something fundamental had shifted. Kong Miho treated her no differently on the surface, but she caught him watching her with those sharp dark eyes, cataloging details she hadn't realized he noticed. When she served his lunch, he thanked her quietly. When she organized his evening briefings, he made sure she understood she could leave early if she felt unwell. The small considerations felt enormous coming from a man who typically treated household staff as living furniture. That evening, as Zara was finishing her cleaning routine in the kitchen, the building's security desk called the penthouse line. Kong Miho answered on the second ring, his voice taking on the clipped tone he used for business. "Sir," said the voice on the speakerphone, "we have a situation in the lobby. A man claiming to be Miss Williams' boyfriend is demanding to see her. He's becoming increasingly agitated and refuses to leave. Should we call the authorities?" Kong Miho's expression didn't change, but Zara felt the temperature in the room drop several degrees. She set down the glass she was holding with hands that had begun to tremble. "No authorities," Kong Miho said, his voice deadly quiet. "Put him in holding room 3 and activate the surveillance feed. I want to see exactly what kind of man thinks he can make demands in my building." Within minutes, Kong Miho had accessed the security system from his home office, multiple screens displaying feeds from throughout the building. Zara found herself standing behind his chair, watching Marcus pace like a caged animal in the small, windowless room where aggressive visitors were detained. He looked exactly as she remembered, tall and lean with the kind of handsome features that had initially attracted her, but now she could see the coldness in his eyes, the entitled fury in every movement. He was not alone. 2 men flanked the room's entrance, both carrying themselves with the particular stillness that suggested concealed weapons and extensive experience using them. Marcus was shouting at the security guards, his voice carrying clearly through the audio feed. "I know she's here," he snarled, pointing an accusing finger at the camera. "Zara Williams belongs to me. She stole money from my business and disappeared like a thief. I want her brought down here immediately, or I'll involve people who don't ask polite questions." Kong Miho leaned back in his chair, his dark eyes fixed on the screen with predatory focus. "Tell me about him," he said quietly, never looking away from Marcus's increasingly agitated performance. Zara swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry. "His name is Marcus Chun. We dated for 8 months before I realized what his business actually involved. When I tried to leave, he made it clear that wasn't an option. The money he's referring to was my own savings that I withdrew when I escaped." "What kind of business?" "Human trafficking, primarily. He imports women from Southeast Asia and sells them to private buyers. I didn't know initially. I thought he was in legitimate import-export, but when I started asking questions about why his associates carried guns and why women disappeared from his warehouse, he decided I knew too much to be trusted with freedom." Kong Miho was silent for a long moment, watching Marcus threaten the security guards with legal action and unspecified consequences. Then he stood, his movements controlled and purposeful, and walked to a wall safe hidden behind an abstract painting. The door opened with a quiet electronic beep, revealing contents that made Zara's breath catch: stacks of cash, official documents, and several handguns arranged with military precision. He selected one of the weapons, checked its magazine with practiced efficiency, and slipped it into a shoulder holster beneath his suit jacket. The entire process took less than 30 seconds and was performed with the casual competence of a man who had done this thousands of times. "You will stay here," he told Zara, his tone allowing no argument. "Lock the door when I leave and don't open it for anyone except me. I'm going to have a conversation with your former boyfriend about boundaries and consequences." "Sir, you don't need to do this. I can handle Marcus myself. I just need time to figure out how to disappear more completely." Kong Miho turned to face her fully, and the look in his dark eyes made Zara's pulse quicken. There was something cold and final in his expression, something that spoke of decisions made and actions that couldn't be unmade. "Zara," he said, and again her name and his precise pronunciation sent an unexpected flutter through her chest. "You work for me. You live under my roof. You are, by definition, under my protection. When someone threatens what's mine, they discover very quickly why I control this territory and others do not." The possessiveness in his voice should have alarmed her. Instead, she found herself feeling something she hadn't experienced in months: genuine safety. This dangerous, powerful man was claiming responsibility for her well-being, and unlike Marcus's possessiveness, Kong Miho's protection felt like a shield rather than a cage. 20 minutes later, Kong Miho returned to the penthouse, his expensive suit as immaculate as when he'd left, his dark hair still perfectly styled. The only sign that anything had happened was the slight scent of night air clinging to his clothing and a certain satisfaction in his eyes. Marcus Chun and his associates have been escorted from the building, he said, settling back into his desk chair with fluid grace. They understand that returning to this property would be inadvisable. Permanently inadvisable. What did you say to him? I explained that you are an employee of my organization, which means harming you constitutes an attack on my business interests. Men in Marcus's position understand the mathematics of power better than they understand emotional appeals. He now knows that pursuing you will cost him more than he can afford to pay. Zara stared at him, trying to process the implications of what had just occurred. In less than an hour, Kang Miho had neutralized a threat that had controlled her life for months. The casual efficiency of it was both reassuring and terrifying. I don't know how to thank you, she said quietly. You don't need to thank me. You need to understand that the situation has changed. Marcus knows where you are now, which means he'll return with different tactics and more dangerous associates. Your safety requires a more comprehensive approach. Kang Miho stood and gestured for her to follow him through the penthouse to a wing she had never been permitted to enter. The guest quarters were smaller than the main living areas, but still luxurious beyond anything Zara had experienced, with a private bedroom, sitting area, and bathroom that featured marble fixtures and heated floors. You will live here now, he said, opening the walk-in closet to reveal it had been stocked with women's clothing in her exact size. Your duties will remain the same, but you will not leave this floor without security escort. I'm assigning 2 guards to ensure your protection around the clock. Sir, I appreciate everything you've done, but I can't accept this. It's too much, too generous. I'm just your maid. I don't deserve this kind of consideration. Kang Miho turned to face her, his sharp features unreadable in the soft lighting of the guest quarters. You are not just my maid anymore, Zara. You are a woman under my protection, which makes you part of my organization. In my world, we take care of our own. The finality in his voice left no room for argument, and Zara found herself nodding acceptance before she had fully processed the magnitude of what was happening. In the span of a single day, she had gone from invisible domestic worker to protected member of Seoul's most powerful crime family. As Kang Miho left her to settle into her new quarters, Zara sat on the edge of the king-sized bed and tried to understand how her life had transformed so completely. 6 hours ago, she had been hiding bruises and praying Marcus would never find her. Now she was living in luxury under the protection of a man who eliminated threats with the same efficiency he used to organize his morning briefings. She should feel afraid. Kang Miho was dangerous, his world was violent, and accepting his protection meant becoming part of something dark and illegal. But as she touched the professional bandage on her cheek and remembered the cold certainty in his voice when he promised Marcus would not return, all she felt was relief. For the first time in months, she could sleep without fear, and that felt like everything. 3 days passed in careful routine. Zara adjusted to her new quarters while maintaining her household duties, always accompanied by one of Kang Miho's security team when she moved through the penthouse. The guards were professional and unobtrusive, but their presence served as a constant reminder that her life had fundamentally changed. She was no longer just hiding from Marcus. She was under the active protection of Seoul's most feared crime boss. On Thursday evening, as Zara finished organizing Kang Miho's correspondence in his home office, he looked up from his financial reports with the kind of focused attention that made her pulse quicken. Sit down, he said, gesturing to the leather chair across from his mahogany desk. We need to discuss your situation in detail. The office was designed to intimidate, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with legal texts and business journals, original artwork that probably cost more than most people's houses, and windows that offered a commanding view of Seoul's financial district. Everything about the space reinforced Kang Miho's position at the apex of power and influence. Even the air seemed heavier here, thick with the weight of decisions that affected thousands of lives. Zara settled into the chair, hyper-aware of how small and uncertain she felt in this environment of wealth and control. Kang Miho closed his laptop with deliberate precision and leaned back, his dark eyes studying her with the thoroughness of a man who missed nothing. Your former boyfriend has been making inquiries, he said without preamble. My sources indicate Marcus Chun has contacted several private investigation firms and at least 2 organizations that specialize in locating missing persons. He's also reached out to associates in the trafficking network, offering a substantial reward for information about your whereabouts. Zara's blood ran cold. She had hoped Marcus would cut his losses and move on to easier targets, but apparently his ego couldn't tolerate being defied. How substantial? She asked quietly. $50,000 for information leading to your location. $100,000 for your actual delivery to a location of his choosing. Those numbers suggest you represent more than just wounded pride to him. The implications hit Zara like a physical blow. Marcus wasn't just angry about her escape. He was treating her like valuable inventory that needed to be recovered. The thought made her stomach clench with familiar fear. Kong Miho leaned forward slightly, his expression serious but not unkind. This changes the nature of the threat you face. Marcus has resources and connections, and he's demonstrated willingness to invest significantly in reclaiming you. Temporary protection is no longer adequate. You need a permanent solution. Sir, I understand the situation is complicated, but I can disappear again. I can leave Seoul, change my identity, start over somewhere he'll never think to look. With what resources? Kong Miho asked, his tone gentle but implacable. You have approximately $3,000 in savings, no valid identification documents that aren't traceable, and no professional references that don't lead back to this address. Marcus has $150,000 available just for finding you, plus whatever he's willing to spend on retrieval operations. The mathematics are not in your favor. Zara stared at him, the hopelessness of her situation settling like lead in her chest. She had been so focused on day-to-day survival that she hadn't fully considered the long-term impossibility of staying ahead of Marcus's resources indefinitely. However, Kong Miho continued, his voice taking on the formal tone he used for business negotiations. There is an alternative that would provide permanent security and mutual benefit. I have a proposition for you. He opened a desk drawer and withdrew a single sheet of paper with typed text, setting it between them like a contract waiting for signatures. The letterhead was embossed with the logo of Seoul's most prestigious law firm. I am offering you a position as my personal assistant and household manager, he said, his words precise and carefully chosen. The salary would be $150,000 per year, paid monthly into a private account accessible only by you. In addition, I would cover the cost of completing your nursing education at Seoul National University, including full tuition, books, and related expenses. Zara's eyes widened. The amount was more money than she had imagined earning in 5 years, and the educational benefits represented the dream she had abandoned when Marcus derailed her life. The position would include private accommodations in this building, a luxury apartment for your immediate family if you choose to relocate them from America, comprehensive medical and dental coverage, and a clothing allowance appropriate for someone in my social circle. You would accompany me to business functions, manage my personal schedule, and oversee the household staff. What would you expect in return? Zara asked, her voice carefully neutral. Because in my experience, men like you don't offer generosity without expecting something specific back. Kong Miho's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his dark eyes that might have been approval for her directness. Complete loyalty and absolute discretion regarding my business operations. You would live on this property under my protection and follow security protocols without question. You would be available when I require your presence, whether for business or personal matters. And you would understand that this arrangement places you permanently within my organization's sphere of influence. The words were formal and businesslike, but Zara heard the underlying possessiveness in his tone. She was being offered unprecedented security and opportunity, but the price was her independence and quite possibly her moral flexibility. And if I decide this arrangement isn't working, she asked, if I want to leave after 6 months or a year? Kong Miho was quiet for a long moment, his sharp features revealing nothing of his thoughts. Then he leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed but his eyes never leaving her face. Zara, he said, and the use of her name sent that familiar flutter through her chest. People who work closely with me learn things that could be damaging if shared with the wrong parties. Complete discretion isn't just preferred, it's mandatory. If you accept this position, You accept that some knowledge cannot be unknown and some associations cannot be undone. The threat was delivered so smoothly that it took a moment for the full implications to register. He was telling her that leaving would not be as simple as giving notice. Once she knew the details of his operations, she would become a permanent security concern. "You're asking me to trade one cage for another," she said quietly. "A prettier cage with better benefits, but still a cage. I'm offering you protection, education, financial security, and a place in an organization that values loyalty above all else. Marcus offers you ownership, objectification, and eventual sale to the highest bidder. The choice between those options seems clear to me." Zara stared at the contract, her mind spinning through possibilities and consequences. The money alone would change everything, not just for her, but for her family back in Chicago. Her grandmother could afford the medical care she needed. Her younger brother could go to college without drowning in debt. The nursing degree would give her skills and credentials that could eventually lead to independence. But accepting meant acknowledging that Kang Mi-ho owned her in ways that might be more subtle than Marcus's brutality, but were no less absolute. She would become part of his world permanently, complicit in whatever darkness funded this luxury. "How long do I have to decide?" she asked. 24 hours, he replied. "Marcus's inquiries are becoming more aggressive, and my sources suggest he's planning to escalate his search methods within the week. This offer provides immediate protection and long-term security, but it expires tomorrow evening at 6 o'clock. Zara looked at the contract again, seeing her future written in legal language that made extraordinary circumstances sound routine. $150,000 per year. Full education funding. Family security. Protection from Marcus and his associates. All she had to do was accept that her freedom was an illusion she couldn't afford. "What happens if I refuse?" she asked. "Then I will provide you with $50,000 cash, forged identification documents, and transportation to any city in the world you choose. You will leave tomorrow night and never return to Seoul. From that point, your safety becomes your own responsibility." The alternative was generous but terrifying. $50,000 would last perhaps 2 years if she was careful, but Marcus's network was international, and running forever was no way to live. Kang Mi-ho stood and moved to the window, his hands clasped behind his back as he gazed out at the glittering lights of the city he controlled. "I am not Marcus," he said without turning around. "I don't take what isn't freely given, and I don't use fear as a tool of control. But I also don't offer protection without expecting absolute loyalty in return. If you accept this position, you become part of my family, with all the benefits and responsibilities that entails." The word family hung in the air between them, loaded with meanings that had nothing to do with blood relations and everything to do with bonds that couldn't be broken without consequences. "I need time to think," Zara said, standing from her chair with legs that felt unsteady. "Of course. Consider your options carefully. Tomorrow evening, we'll finalize whatever decision you've made." As Zara left the office, the contract's details burned in her memory like a brand. $150,000. Complete education. Family security. Permanent protection. All for accepting that her life now belonged to Kang Mi-ho in ways she was only beginning to understand. That night, she lay awake staring at the ceiling of her luxury guest quarters, weighing freedom against safety, independence against security. By dawn, she had reached a decision that would change everything forever. 3 months after signing the contract that redefined her existence, Zara Williams had transformed from a woman hiding behind concealer and fear into someone she barely recognized in the mirror. The luxury apartment Kang Mi-ho had provided was twice the size of her previous shared dormitory, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered breathtaking views of Seoul's skyline and furnishings that belonged in interior design magazines. But more than the material comfort, it was the absence of fear that marked the most profound change. For the first time in over a year, she slept through the night without startling awake at unexpected sounds. The morning routine had evolved into something approaching domestic partnership rather than employer-employee efficiency. Zara arrived at the penthouse each day at 7 a.m., but instead of maintaining the invisible silence of her early employment, she and Kang Mi-ho had developed an easy rhythm of shared breakfast and morning briefings. She organized his schedule while he reviewed overnight reports from his various business interests, and their conversation had progressed from purely professional exchanges to something that felt remarkably like companionship. This particular Tuesday began like most others, with Zara setting Kang Miho's coffee beside his morning briefing documents and settling into the chair across from his desk to review the day's agenda. He looked up from his tablet with the slight smile that had become increasingly frequent, his dark eyes holding in warmth that would have been unimaginable during her first month of employment. "The Kim Industries meeting has been moved to 2:30, she said, updating her electronic calendar with practiced efficiency. "Your attorney called about the shipping contract negotiations, and the charity gala seating arrangements need final approval by Thursday. Cancel the 4 o'clock with the bank consortium," Kang Miho replied, his attention focused on a report that seemed to be causing him concern. "Something more pressing has developed that requires immediate attention." Zara noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly when he reviewed certain documents. After 3 months of working closely together, she had learned to read his moods with an accuracy that sometimes surprised them both. "Bad news?" she asked gently, refilling his coffee cup without being asked. "Territorial dispute in Busan. One of our shipping operations was attacked last night by the Yamamoto family. 3 of my men are in the hospital, and 2 containers of merchandise are missing." The casual mention of violence still made Zara's stomach clench, but she had gradually accepted that Kang Miho's world operated by different rules than the one she had known. What she hadn't expected was how naturally she had begun to see these challenges through his eyes, understanding the delicate balance of power and respect that kept his organization functioning. "Do you need to travel there personally?" she asked, already mentally rearranging his schedule to accommodate the possibility. "Not yet. I'm sending Park and his team to assess the situation and deliver an appropriate response." Sometimes problems resolve themselves when people remember the consequences of poor decision-making. The understated menace in his tone should have frightened her, but instead Zara found herself admiring his controlled approach to crisis management. Kang Miho never acted from anger or impulse. Every response was calculated for maximum effectiveness with minimum unnecessary escalation. That evening, Zara accompanied Kang Miho to a dinner meeting with potential business partners, her role officially described as personal assistant but functioning more like a diplomatic interpreter. She had discovered an unexpected talent for reading people's motivations and reactions, skills that complemented Kang Miho's more direct approach to negotiation. The restaurant was the kind of establishment where reservations were measured in months rather than weeks, with private dining rooms that ensured complete discretion for sensitive conversations. Zara wore a tailored black dress from the professional wardrobe Kang Miho had provided, elegant and conservative, but expensive enough to signal her importance within his organization. The meeting involved the acquisition of a small shipping company whose owner was facing financial difficulties. As Zara watched the negotiations unfold, she marveled at Kang Miho's ability to project both genuine concern for the man's situation and absolute certainty about the deal's terms. He was offering a generous buyout that would solve the owner's immediate problems while incorporating the company's assets into his existing network. "Mr. Song," Kang Miho said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made opposing him seem impossible. "Your company has excellent infrastructure and a solid reputation for reliability. I'm prepared to offer 40% above current market valuation, with guaranteed employment for all current staff and retention of your management position for the first 2 years of transition." The offer was more generous than anything Song could expect from legitimate buyers, but it came with the understanding that his shipping routes would occasionally carry cargo that wasn't listed on any official manifest. Song's relief was visible as he accepted terms that would save his family business while acknowledging its new purpose. As they left the restaurant, Kang Miho placed his hand on the small of Zara's back to guide her through the crowded lobby, the touch casual but somehow proprietary. She had noticed these small gestures becoming more frequent over recent weeks. The way he ensured she was seated before taking his own chair, how he automatically moved to place himself between her and potential threats, the protective positioning that had become second nature. "You handled that well," he told her as they settled into the back seat of his armored sedan. "Song was more nervous about your presence than mine. Your opinion of his character carried weight in his decision-making process. I told him his employees speak well of him, and his wife clearly adores him," Zara replied, surprised by the pride in Kang Miho's voice. People reveal their true nature in how they treat those who can't help them. He's desperate, but not cruel. Exactly the kind of insight that makes you invaluable to me, Kang Miho said, his dark eyes studying her face in the dim lighting of the car's interior. You see things I miss because you understand people differently than I do. The compliment sent an unexpected warmth through Zara's chest, and she realized with some alarm that pleasing Kang Miho had become genuinely important to her, not just professionally but personally. Back at the penthouse, their evening routine had evolved into something that felt remarkably like domesticity. While Kang Miho reviewed overnight reports from his various enterprises, Zara organized the next day's priorities and updated security protocols. But instead of the formal distance that had characterized their early interactions, they had begun sharing observations about their day, discussing challenges and solutions with the ease of established partners. The university called about my course registration, Zara mentioned as she organized his correspondence. I can begin the accelerated nursing program in January if I complete the prerequisite chemistry coursework online this semester. That's excellent news. How do you feel about returning to academic work after such a long break? Nervous, but excited. I had forgotten how much I missed learning, having goals that were completely my own. Thank you for making it possible. Kang Miho looked up from his reports, his expression serious. Your education benefits me as well as you. The more skilled and knowledgeable you become, the more valuable you are to my organization. Intelligent women with medical training are useful in many situations. But there was something in his eyes that suggested his interest in her education went beyond organizational utility, a warmth that had nothing to do with business calculations and everything to do with genuine pride in her accomplishments. As the weeks passed, Zara found herself increasingly comfortable in Kang Miho's presence, no longer hyper-aware of the danger he represented, but instead appreciating the complex man behind the reputation. She had seen him negotiate multi-million-dollar deals with cold precision, then spend 20 minutes ensuring that his housekeeper's grandson received proper medical care for a broken arm. He was capable of breathtaking generosity and terrifying ruthlessness, sometimes within the same hour. One evening in late November, as Seoul's early winter settled over the city with crystalline clarity, Zara found Kang Miho standing at his office windows staring out at the lights below. His posture was tense, shoulders rigid with stress that seemed unusually pronounced. The Busan situation is escalating, he said without turning around. Yamamoto is pushing territory boundaries that haven't been challenged in 5 years. If I don't respond decisively, other families will interpret it as weakness. What are your options? Zara asked, moving to stand beside him at the window. The city sparkled below them like a circuit board, millions of lights representing lives and dreams and ambitions that had nothing to do with territorial disputes between criminal organizations. Negotiation, escalation, or elimination, Kang Miho replied, his voice carrying the weight of decisions that would affect dozens of lives. Yamamoto has rejected 2 attempts at diplomatic resolution, which leaves options that become increasingly permanent. And you have to be the one making those choices. The observation seemed to surprise him, and he turned to look at her directly. Yes, he said simply. Leadership means accepting responsibility for consequences that others don't want to consider. Every choice I make ripples through hundreds of lives, and there's no one else to blame when those choices prove costly. For the first time, Zara heard something approaching vulnerability in his voice, a recognition of the isolation that came with absolute authority. Without thinking, she reached out and placed her hand on his arm, the gesture instinctive and comforting. You don't have to carry it all alone, she said quietly. I know I can't help with the decisions, but you don't have to process the weight of them in isolation. Kang Miho looked down at her hand resting on his forearm, then back at her face, something shifting in his dark eyes. When did you stop being afraid of me? He asked, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. I'm not sure, Zara admitted, realizing that somewhere over the past 3 months her wariness had transformed into something approaching trust. Maybe when I realized that your version of protection doesn't require me to disappear or diminish myself. You've made me stronger, not smaller. The admission hung between them, loaded with implications that neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge. But as Kang Miho covered her hand with his own, his touch warm and steady, Zara understood that their arrangement had evolved far beyond the business contract they had signed. Whatever this had become, it was no longer purely transactional. That night, as she lay in her luxurious apartment trying to process the day's revelations, Zara admitted to herself what she had been avoiding for weeks. She was falling in love with Kang Mi-ho, this dangerous, powerful man who had given her safety and purpose and something that felt remarkably like partnership. The realization should have terrified her, but instead it felt like the most natural thing in the world. The attack came on a Thursday morning in December, swift and professional in execution, that spoke of careful planning and extensive resources. Zara was returning from her chemistry class at Seoul National University when the black sedan pulled alongside her security escort's vehicle at a traffic intersection. What followed lasted less than 30 seconds, but changed everything forever. The first indication of trouble was when her bodyguard, Jung, suddenly stiffened and reached for his concealed weapon. But the attackers had planned for that possibility. The sedan's tinted windows rolled down to reveal three men with military-grade weaponry, their faces covered but their movements coordinated with the precision of professionals who had executed similar operations many times before. Jung managed to fire twice before the tranquilizer dart caught him in the neck, his body slumping over the steering wheel as their vehicle crashed into the intersection's safety barrier. Zara's last clear memory was of strong hands dragging her from the wreckage while a voice with a distinctly Japanese accent assured her that cooperation would minimize unnecessary pain. She woke in darkness, her wrists bound with zip ties, and her head pounding from whatever drug they had used to keep her unconscious during transport. The room was cold, concrete-walled, and completely windowless except for a single fluorescent bulb that cast harsh shadows across industrial shelving and abandoned machinery. The scent of rust and motor oil suggested an abandoned garage or warehouse, somewhere isolated enough that screaming would attract no attention. Her captors had been waiting for her to regain consciousness. The man who entered the room 20 minutes after she awakened was clearly the operations leader, Japanese with the kind of expensive grooming that spoke of significant resources and organizational backing. His suit was perfectly tailored despite the industrial surroundings, and his English carried the cultured accent of private schools and international business dealings. "Miss Williams," he said, settling into a metal chair positioned directly in front of her bound form. "My name is Takeshi Yamamoto, and I represent certain business interests that have come into conflict with your employer's territorial expansion. I trust you understand why your cooperation would be beneficial to all parties involved." Zara's mouth felt dry from the drugs, but her mind was clearing rapidly. She had spent months listening to Kang Mi-ho discuss territorial disputes and rival organizations, and she recognized Yamamoto's name from intelligence reports about the Busan shipping conflicts. "I don't know what you think I can tell you," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her system. "I'm just his personal assistant. I organize his schedule and manage his correspondence." Yamamoto smiled, the expression cold and calculating. "Please don't insult my intelligence, Miss Williams. My sources indicate that Kang Mi-ho has invested considerable resources in your protection and education. Men like him don't make such investments without expecting significant returns. You have access to his private offices, his personal communications, and his evening routines. That access makes you invaluable." For the next 6 hours, Yamamoto alternated between reasonable requests for information and increasingly creative threats designed to encourage cooperation. He wanted details about Kang Mi-ho's shipping schedules, security protocols, and financial arrangements with legitimate businesses that provided cover for illegal operations. Each time Zara refused to provide the requested information, the consequences became more explicitly violent. But Zara had learned something important during her months under Kang Mi-ho's protection. She was stronger than she had ever imagined. The woman who had hidden bruises and cowered from Marcus's threats no longer existed. In her place was someone who understood that loyalty meant accepting consequences, even when those consequences were terrifying. "I told you," she repeated for the dozenth time as Yamamoto's patience began to fray. "I organize his calendar and serve coffee to his guests. If you think he shares operational details with domestic staff, you don't understand the kind of man you're dealing with." Meanwhile, Kang Mi-ho had discovered Zara's disappearance within 40 minutes of the attack. when Jung failed to check in at the designated time and traffic cameras revealed the intersection collision. What followed was a mobilization of resources that demonstrated why the Kong organization controlled Seoul's criminal landscape with such authority. Within 2 hours, every contact in law enforcement, private security, and criminal intelligence was activated to locate the missing vehicle. Traffic analysis revealed the sedan's route through the city's industrial district, while telecommunications monitoring identified unusual activity from known Yamamoto associates. By evening, Kang Mi-ho had narrowed the search to 3 possible locations and was personally leading the assault teams that would investigate each site. The rescue operation at the abandoned textile warehouse was swift and devastating in its efficiency. Yamamoto's security team found themselves facing opponents who had trained for exactly this scenario, men whose loyalty to Kang Mi-ho was absolute, and whose methods were more advanced than anything the Yakuza family had anticipated. Zara heard the gunfire begin at approximately 10 p.m., sharp bursts of automatic weapons followed by the kind of tactical movement that suggested professional military training. The sound grew closer over the course of 15 minutes, punctuated by shouted commands in Korean and the occasional scream of pain from Yamamoto's diminishing forces. When the door to her makeshift prison finally burst open, Kang Mi-ho stood silhouetted against the hallway, lighting like an avenging angel dressed in tactical gear. His dark eyes found her immediately, scanning for injuries with the kind of desperate intensity that revealed exactly how much her safety meant to him. Yamamoto was on the floor beside her chair, unconscious from a head wound that was bleeding profusely but not fatally. 3 of his associates lay motionless in positions that suggested they had died quickly and efficiently. "Are you hurt?" Kang Mi-ho asked, his voice carefully controlled despite the fury radiating from every line of his body. His hands moved gently as he cut through her restraints, checking for injuries with the thoroughness of someone who understood exactly what interrogation could involve. "I'm fine," Zara replied, though her voice shook slightly as the adrenaline began to fade. "They wanted information about your operations, but I didn't tell them anything. I wouldn't betray you." The relief that crossed Kang Mi-ho's features was so profound that it transformed his entire expression, revealing depths of emotion he typically kept hidden behind professional composure. The ride back to the penthouse was conducted in relative silence, both of them processing the implications of what had occurred. But once they reached the safety of his private quarters, with additional security posted at every entrance and all communications monitored for potential threats, the careful control both of them had maintained finally cracked. "You could have been killed," Kang Mi-ho said, his voice rough with emotions he couldn't quite suppress. "If they had decided you were more valuable dead than alive, if I hadn't found you in time, if the rescue had gone wrong." "But you did find me," Zara interrupted, moving closer to where he stood at the window overlooking the city. "You came for me, just like you promised you would. I never doubted that." Kang Mi-ho turned to face her, his dark eyes bright with unshed tears that revealed more vulnerability than she had ever seen from him. "You don't understand," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I can't lose someone else. I can't fail to protect someone I care about again." The words opened a door that had been carefully sealed for years, and the story that followed explained everything about the man Zara had come to love. Kang Mi-ho's younger sister had been kidnapped by a rival organization 5 years earlier, taken specifically because the attackers knew how much she meant to him. He had been in the middle of crucial expansion negotiations, too focused on business to notice the warning signs or provide adequate protection. "By the time I realized what was happening, she was already dead," he said, his voice hollow with old grief. "They sent me pieces of her jewelry with ransom demands they never intended to honor. She died alone and afraid because I was too arrogant to believe anyone would dare target my family." The revelation hit Zara like a physical blow, suddenly understanding the source of his protective instincts and the reason her safety had become so important to him. She was his second chance, his opportunity to succeed where he had failed before. "That's why you recognized the signs when you saw my bruises," she said softly. "Why you couldn't ignore what Marcus was doing to me. I swore I would never again allow someone under my protection to be hurt because of my failures," Kang Mi-ho replied. "But today proved that even with all my resources, all my planning, I can't guarantee your safety. The thought of losing you the way I lost her." He couldn't finish the sentence, But Zara understood what he was trying to say. Somewhere over the past months, she had become essential to him in ways that went far beyond their professional arrangement. She was no longer just a woman under his protection. She was the woman whose well-being determined his peace of mind. "You didn't lose me," she said, reaching out to touch his face with gentle fingers. "I'm here, I'm safe, and I'm not going anywhere. What we have isn't just about protection anymore, is it?" "No," Kang Miho admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "It stopped being about protection the moment I realized that your happiness mattered more to me than my own. I love you, Zara. Not as my employee or my responsibility, but as the woman who brought light back into a world I thought was permanently dark." The words hung between them for a moment before Zara closed the distance, her lips meeting his in a kiss that tasted like relief and promise and the kind of future neither of them had dared to imagine. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard, and something fundamental had shifted in the space between them. "I love you too," she whispered against his lips. "I think I have for weeks, but I was too afraid to admit it. Too afraid it wasn't real, or that it couldn't last." "It's real," Kang Miho assured her, his arms tightening around her as if he could shield her from every possible threat through sheer force of will. "And it's going to last forever, because I'm never letting you go." The aftermath of the Yamamoto crisis lasted 3 days, during which Kang Miho systematically eliminated every trace of the threat that had dared to target what belonged to him. Takashi Yamamoto and his remaining associates simply disappeared from Seoul, their organizations dissolved and their territories redistributed among families that understood the consequences of challenging the Kang Empire. No official reports were filed, no investigations launched, and no questions asked by anyone who valued their continued existence. Zara spent those 3 days in the penthouse under constant protection, but the security felt different now. Where once she had been a protected asset, she was now something infinitely more precious, the woman Kang Miho loved enough to wage war for. The difference was subtle but profound, visible in the way his security team treated her with the deference reserved for family, and in how Kang Miho himself seemed unable to let her out of his sight for more than a few minutes. On Sunday evening, as Seoul's winter settled over the city with crystalline clarity, Kang Miho found her standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his private study, watching the lights sparkle across the metropolitan landscape. She had been reading case studies for her nursing coursework, but the textbooks lay forgotten as she processed the magnitude of what had changed between them. "You're mine," he said quietly, moving to stand behind her close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body against her back. The words were not a question or a request, but a statement of absolute truth that resonated through every fiber of her being. "Yes," Zara replied, leaning back against his chest as his arms encircled her waist. "And you're mine, broken pieces and all. Forever," Kang Miho murmured against her hair, his voice carrying the weight of a vow that meant more than any legal document. "I'm never letting you go, Zara. Not to Marcus, not to rivals like Yamamoto, not to anything or anyone who thinks they have a claim on your life." She turned in his arms to face him, studying the sharp features that had once intimidated her, but now represented safety and home and everything she had never dared to dream possible. The man who had terrified Seoul's criminal underworld was looking at her with the kind of tender devotion that made her heart race. "What does forever look like for us?" she asked, her fingers tracing the strong line of his jaw. "Because I need to know this is real, that we're building something permanent and not just reacting to crisis and adrenaline." Kang Miho was quiet for a moment, his dark eyes studying her face with the thoroughness she had come to associate with his most important decisions. Then he stepped back and withdrew a small velvet box from his jacket pocket, opening it to reveal a diamond ring that caught the city lights and threw them back in brilliant sparks. "Forever looks like my wife," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion underlying every word. "The woman who stands beside me as an equal partner, not just in my business, but in my life. The woman who will be the mother of my children and the matriarch of the Kang family legacy." The ring was stunning, a perfect solitaire surrounded by smaller diamonds that formed an intricate pattern suggesting both strength and beauty. But more than the jewelry itself, it was what the offer represented: complete integration into his world, permanent security, and recognition as his equal partner rather than his protected possession. Zara Williams, he continued, his pronunciation of her name carrying the same reverence he might use for a prayer. Will you marry me and become the center of everything I've built? Yes, she whispered, her voice breaking slightly as the magnitude of the moment overwhelmed her. Yes, I want to be your wife and your partner and the mother of your children. I want forever with you. Kang Miho slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly, then kissed her with the kind of passionate intensity that left no doubt about his feelings. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard, and the future stretched before them like a promise written in starlight. Over the following weeks, the reality of their engagement became a transformation that touched every aspect of Zara's existence. The legal arrangements alone were staggering in their complexity and generosity. A prenuptial agreement that guaranteed her complete financial independence regardless of what happened to their marriage, trust funds that would ensure her family's security for generations, and legal protections that made her an official partner in several legitimate business enterprises. But beyond the financial considerations, Kang Miho was integrating her into the social structure of his organization in ways that demonstrated her new status unambiguously. She accompanied him to meetings with legitimate business leaders, her input valued and her presence clearly indicating her importance within his hierarchy. The criminal aspects of his empire remained largely hidden from her direct involvement, but she understood that her safety and status were guaranteed by the same power that made those darker operations possible. The wedding planning revealed the extent of Kang Miho's resources and connections. The ceremony would take place at Seoul's most exclusive private estate, with guest lists that included legitimate business leaders, political figures, and criminal organization heads who controlled territory throughout East Asia. The dress was designed by Korea's premier fashion house, the catering handled by Michelin-starred chefs, and the security arrangements managed by professionals who typically protected heads of state. 1 month before the wedding, Zara's family arrived from Chicago, their expenses paid and their accommodations arranged in a luxury hotel that provided complete security while allowing them to experience Seoul's finest amenities. Her grandmother, whose medical care had been quietly funded by Kang Miho since their engagement, was well enough to travel for the first time in years. Her younger brother had been accepted to university with his tuition fully covered by a scholarship that bore no obvious connection to the Kang family, but was nevertheless their gift. The transformation was complete on their wedding day. As Zara walked down an aisle lined with white roses and flanked by men whose loyalty to Kang Miho was absolute. She wore silk and diamonds, her natural hair styled in elegant braids that incorporated traditional Korean elements, and her smile reflected the joy of a woman who had found not just safety, but genuine happiness. When Kang Miho lifted her veil, his dark eyes held the kind of tender possessiveness that made her feel treasured rather than owned. The vows they exchanged were traditional on the surface, but loaded with private meanings that referenced their unconventional beginning and the challenges they had overcome together. I promise to protect and cherish you for the rest of our lives, he said, his voice carrying absolute conviction. You will never again know fear or want or uncertainty about your place in this world. I promise to stand beside you as your equal partner, to support your decisions and share your burdens, and to love you through whatever challenges we face together, she replied, her voice steady and strong. The reception that followed was a celebration that demonstrated the scope of Kang Miho's influence and the respect he commanded across multiple worlds. Business leaders who normally avoided any association with criminal elements attended alongside organization heads who controlled territory from Seoul to Tokyo. The message was clear. Zara was now under the protection of one of Asia's most powerful men, and harming her would bring consequences that transcended normal boundaries. As the evening wound down and the last guests departed, Kang Miho and Zara stood together on the estate's private terrace, watching the city lights spread across Seoul's landscape like fallen stars. She wore his ring and his name, and tomorrow they would begin their honeymoon in a private villa where security was invisible but absolute. 6 months ago, I was hiding bruises and counting dollars toward an escape fund, Zara said quietly, her head resting against Kang Miho's shoulder. I never imagined that running from one dangerous man would lead me to loving another who makes me feel safer than I've ever felt in my life. "You're not running anymore," Kang Miho replied, his arms tightening around her with protective certainty. "You're standing beside your husband, the man who will spend the rest of his life ensuring that nothing can ever hurt you again." The city sprawled before them, millions of lives and dreams and ambitions that had nothing to do with their story, but somehow seemed smaller and more manageable from their vantage point of absolute security. Zara was no longer a frightened woman seeking invisibility. She was the wife of Seoul's most powerful crime boss, protected by resources that could eliminate any threat and surrounded by luxury that turned every day into a gift. But more than the material security, more than the wealth and power and protection, was the knowledge that she was loved completely by a man who would move heaven and earth to keep her safe. As they stood together watching their city sleep beneath a canopy of stars, Zara understood that she had found something rarer than riches, a love that transformed danger into safety and fear into the absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. Forever had finally begun.